They said she was just being a worried mom, but worried moms don't break into your home, do they? Mine did. She cooked in my kitchen, read my mail, and called my boss to say I was unstable. I didn't argue. I moved without telling her. A week later, cops called me to confirm I was alive, because she tried to break into my old apartment again. I'm Emily Hartman, and this is how I learned peace sometimes requires a police report. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The house where I grew up always smelled like lemon polish and control. Every window shone, every rug lined up straight, every drawer opened smoothly, because my mother checked them daily. I was 17, sitting cross-legged on my bed in our Portland house trying to write in my notebook before she finished folding laundry. The door was half open. I could hear her slippers whispering across the hall. When the sound stopped outside my room, my hand froze on the page. The door swung open without a knock. She stood there holding a basket of clean clothes, her eyes scanning everything in a single sweep. The bedspread, the desk, the open notebook. "What are you hiding, sweetheart?" She asked, her tone almost sweet, but edged with that sharp curiosity that always meant trouble. "Nothing," I said quickly. "It's just personal." She smiled, setting the basket on the chair. "Nothing in this house is personal." I watched her fingers trail across the spine of my journal, hovering. Just long enough to make my stomach twist. When I was 12, she'd done the same thing. Only then, it was my flip phone. I can still see her at the dinner table scrolling through my texts with a boy named Ryan, while my dad Robert chuckled, and my sister Lily snorted milk through her nose. They laughed like it was a family game night. They didn't think it was cruel, I whisper in memory. They thought it was parenting. That night I learned how humiliation can wear a smile. Now at 17, I kept my voice steady while she inspected my dresser like a customs officer. "You need to pick your clothes up more often," she said, neatly stacking folded t-shirts on my desk as if I hadn't already done it that morning. "You never know who might come in." "I do know," I muttered. She ignored that, pulling the curtains back to check the view as though the street outside might hold evidence of rebellion. My father's voice called from downstairs. "Karen, let the girl study. She's writing in that journal again," she called back. "I just want to be sure she's not hiding anything dark." Dark. That was her favorite word for things she couldn't control. After she left, I sat there for a long time listening to the sound of her humming fade down the hall, and wrote one line before closing the notebook. Privacy is something other people get to have. By senior year, my idea of freedom was college brochures stacked on my desk. I spent months filling out applications circling campuses far from Oregon. I dreamed of California. Sun noise strangers who didn't know me. For weeks, I mailed forms, triple-checked deadlines. I never told her which college I wanted most. I thought if I kept one secret, it might stay mine. Then, one afternoon, the guidance counselor, Mrs. Hayes, called me in. Her voice was kind but distant, as if she'd already practiced what she was going to say. "Emily, your mother contacted the admissions office. She said you decided to withdraw your application to Redwood University. They've closed your file." I remember gripping the edge of the chair, staring at her framed diploma on the wall. "She said what Mrs. Hayes hesitated. She sounded certain. "I thought you knew." "I didn't change my mind." "She did. For me. When I got home that day, she was making dinner, humming Apron Tied Tight. "I saved you from a mistake," she said when I confronted her. "California's too far. You're not ready." My father didn't even look up from his paper. "She'll thank you someday," he murmured. I didn't thank her. I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door for the first time in my life. My hand trembled around the knob. The click was louder than I expected. For 10 seconds, silence held. Then her voice rose sharp and shrill. "Don't ever shut me out again." Her fist hit the door once, twice, and then nothing. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, listening to the house breathe around me. I should have felt safe, but guilt seeped in like smoke. That was the trick. She could make control sound like love and defiance feel like betrayal. Years later, standing in the doorway of my apartment in Seattle, I could still hear that echo. The knock. The anger, the plea hidden inside it. I looked at the modern lock on my own door, the kind that clicked softly and held firm, no matter how hard you turned it. That was the last door I'd closed without guilt. Until I realized she never stopped holding the key. The rain was already falling when I reached Seattle, the kind that moves sideways and smells faintly of the ocean. I carried the last box up 3 flights of stairs, kicked open the door, and stood in my new apartment, a studio on Capitol Hill, barely big enough for one person, but bright modern mine. The balcony overlooked a wet skyline, where cranes and coffee shops shared the horizon. I unpacked boxes labeled dream design samples, college memories, and lined them against the wall. My fingers traced the cold window pane as I whispered, "This is it." For the first time in my life, no one could burst in without knocking. Peace, I told myself, was a room I could decorate. I hung my sketches above the couch, set up a small drafting table, and turned on a soft jazz playlist. When the music filled the air, I thought maybe this was what adulthood sounded like. Quiet, self-owned, unapproved. My phone buzzed. FaceTime. Mom. I hesitated but answered. Her face filled the screen close-up and concerned. "Did you eat dinner? You look pale. You're not skipping meals, are you?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." Dad leaned into the frame waving. "Hey, kiddo, send us your new address. I want to mail you that coffee grinder you liked." I laughed, trying to sound casual. "Sure, maybe later." Mom frowned. "You should eat something warm. Maybe I'll come up next weekend and cook." "It's fine," I said again, a little too fast. She smiled the way people do before they insist. "You can't live on cereal, sweetheart." We hung up after a few minutes, and I turned my phone face down. The rain outside kept drumming patient endless. I unpacked until midnight and fell asleep on the couch, surrounded by open boxes and the smell of new paint. The first few days were blissfully quiet. I went to work at the design firm downtown, learned new names, new routes, new coffee orders. Every evening I walked home through Pike Street's glow umbrella tilted against the drizzle. My independence felt fragile but real, like glass I finally owned. Then one night around 10, my phone buzzed again. "Mom." I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Hey, Mom. What's up?" "I was just thinking," she said, "what if something happened to you and we couldn't get in?" "You should mail me a spare key, just in case." I exhaled. "Mom." "I'm 5 hours away. I'm fine. Emergencies don't check distance, Emily. What if you fall? Or a gas leak?" "You could pass out and no one would know." I laughed softly to ease the tension. "I live in a building full of people. Someone would notice." She went quiet, that long silence she used like a weapon. "I'd sleep better knowing you're safe." The guilt hit its mark. By the next morning I was standing at a post office counter, staring at a small padded envelope with a single silver key inside. I told myself it was harmless, responsible even. Still, dropping it into the mailbox felt like surrender. I didn't realize I'd mailed away my boundaries with it. A week later, she arrived without warning. Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of eggs sizzling and the smell of bacon. For 1 second, my half-asleep brain thought I'd left the stove on. I stepped into the kitchen and froze. She stood there in a floral apron, humming to herself as she flipped pancakes. "Good morning, sweetheart." I let myself in. "You were still sleeping." I blinked. "Mom, what are you doing here? Surprising you." "I missed you." "Your father's fishing this weekend, and I thought I'd check on my girl." "Check on me," I repeated. "You drove 5 hours to check on me." She grinned, scraping eggs onto a plate. "Don't be dramatic. Eat before it gets cold." The rest of the morning felt like a fever dream. She reorganized my pantry, moved plates to different cabinets, complained about the parking situation and how dangerous the city seemed. "People here don't even make eye contact," she said, shaking her head. "How do you know who to trust?" I tried to smile. "I trust myself." She didn't respond. Instead, she cleaned the counter that was already spotless. By afternoon, she announced she was leaving. As she grabbed her purse, I noticed her hand slip into her pocket, a glint of silver catching the light. "Is that my spare key?" I asked. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "Now you don't have to worry if you forget yours. I'll keep it safe." My mouth went dry. "Mom, that's not—" "Oh, hush," she said, patting my arm. "You'll thank me later." When the door closed behind her, the apartment felt smaller. I sat on the couch, listening to the rain hit the glass, the echo of her voice still filling the space. Freedom shouldn't have to apologize, but mine always did. That night, I walked from room to room, touching the things she'd moved. Plates, spices, even a picture frame she'd straightened. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. It felt like she'd left fingerprints on the air itself. I stood at the window watching headlights crawl through the rain and told myself it was just her being a mother. She'd go back to Portland and things would calm down. I'd reclaim my space, my routine, my peace. Still, as I turned off the lights and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not really. She had the key now. And the funny thing about keys is once someone has one, they never have to knock. It was a Sunday morning, and I woke up to a sound that didn't belong in my apartment. The soft hiss of oil hitting a hot pan, the metallic scrape of a wooden spoon against steel. At first, half buried under my comforter, I thought I was dreaming. Then the smell hit, garlic onions, something rich and savory simmering. My stomach tightened before my mind caught up. I sat up, heart-pounding, listening. Someone was in my kitchen. I crept down the hallway, still in pajamas, hair-tangled socks sliding on the floor. When I turned the corner, I froze. There she was, my mother, standing at the stove like she owned the place, a floral apron tied over her sweater. My father sat on my couch, remote in hand, wearing those same worn slippers he always wore at home. And Lily, my little sister, was curled up, scrolling through her phone earbuds, in like this was normal. Mom. I stammered, How did you get in here? Karen didn't even flinch. Emergency key, she said lightly. You weren't answering your phone, sweetheart. I looked at my dad, but he just shrugged. We thought you might be sick. She didn't break in. She walked in like she owned the place. The smell of garlic clung to everything. The windows fogged from the heat of her cooking. My kitchen looked different, messier, fuller, invaded. Your fridge was practically empty, she continued, stirring the pot. You can't live on salad and deadlines. People need real food, Mom. I was going to grocery shop later, I said, trying to sound calm. She waved a hand. Later means never, Emily. Sit, eat. I'm not hungry, I said quietly. Karen frowned. You work too much. You forget to take care of yourself. I stood there holding my own elbows, feeling the walls inch closer. Mom, please just text me next time before you come over. Her head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing like I'd said something cruel. Text. I'm your mother, not a guest. I took a breath. I know. But You don't have to explain, she interrupted, turning back to the stove. Family shouldn't need permission to see each other. Dad chuckled softly, eyes still on the TV. You know your mother, she worries. I can tell, I said under my breath. Lily finally looked up from her phone. Relax, Em. She's just cooking. I stared at her, amazed how easily she accepted it. In my apartment, I said. Lily rolled her eyes and went back to her screen. I walked over to the counter, trying to reclaim my space. Mom, I'm serious. This isn't okay. You can't just let yourself in whenever you feel like it. Karen didn't even turn around. I'm not just letting myself in. I'm making sure you're safe. Look around. This neighborhood isn't exactly friendly. There was a break-in on the news just last week. That was across town, I said. Still, it happens, she said. She ladled soup into a bowl, set it on the counter with a flourish. Here, taste this. It'll warm you up. I'm fine, I said. Though my voice cracked halfway through the word. For a moment she went still, wooden spoon suspended above the pot. Then she smiled tightly, that practiced expression she used when pretending not to be angry. You always were stubborn. The tension in the room felt like static. I could hear the faint whir of the ceiling fan, the rain tapping against the balcony glass. Every sound amplified. Dad lowered the volume on the TV. Come on, sweetheart. Don't start another argument. Your mom's just trying to help. Helping doesn't mean crossing boundaries. I said a little too sharply. Karen turned hands on hips, eyes sharp. What boundaries? We're family. We share things. That's what families do. Her voice filled the room, and suddenly I felt like I was 17 again, standing in that same powerless silence. I stepped back, palms, sweaty breath uneven. I'm not having this conversation right now. She looked at me, eyes narrowing in disappointment, then softened her tone. Okay. I won't argue. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something silver. Keys. My keys. What are those? I asked, though I already knew. She jingled them lightly, the sound slicing through the quiet. This one's for the gate, and this one's for the mailbox. So it's easier next time. I stared at her. Next time, she smiled as if that explained everything. I know you hate surprises, so this way we won't have to bother you. You'll barely notice. My throat tightened. I wanted to yell, to grab the keys, to throw them out the window, but I couldn't. Years of conditioning glued my feet to the floor. Mom, I said softly, please don't do this again. She didn't answer. She washed her hands, untied the apron, and kissed my cheek before heading for the door. Dad stood, patted my shoulder. "You'll understand when you have kids." I didn't look at him. "I don't think I will." When the door finally closed behind them, the silence was deafening. The apartment smelled like soup and guilt. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up after them, putting back the dishes she'd moved, scraping food into the trash, trying to erase any sign they'd been there. But the air still felt occupied. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain slide down the window. Somewhere in the dark, a car passed, and its headlights caught the metal of the spare key still hanging by the door. The sound of keys jingling echoed in my mind, soft but relentless. She didn't just rearrange my kitchen. She rearranged the definition of my space. When I pushed open the door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Grease and ketchup, the kind that lingers from cheap takeout. The second thing was silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes after a storm. The apartment felt wrong. My suitcase rolled over something sticky. I looked down and saw a crumpled napkin on the floor, half a French fry still clinging to it. My stomach tightened as I stepped further inside. The bed was a mess, comforter half on the floor, pillows dented like someone had just gotten up. My throw blanket, the one I always folded at the edge of the bed, was twisted into a knot. I touched it, still faintly warm. The kitchen counter was worse. 3 fast food containers stacked crookedly near the sink soda cans, dripping condensation onto my cutting board. The fridge door hung slightly open. I could see my leftovers pushed aside to make room for someone else's stuff. I moved toward the living area, pulse quickening. My laptop sat open on the coffee table, still glowing faintly. When I touched the trackpad, the screen woke up to a TikTok feed full of dance videos I didn't recognize. My work tabs were gone. Whoever had used it didn't even bother to close anything. In the bathroom, my makeup bag was unzipped. Brushes, scattered lipstick caps missing. The sink had a ring of foundation residue, the kind my sister always left behind. When I opened my closet, I froze. My clothes were shoved to one side, hangers tangled. My favorite sweater, the soft gray one I wore for client meetings, was gone. On the floor sat a pair of sneakers I didn't own. It felt like my life had been borrowed, tried on, and discarded. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother. She answered on the first ring, voice cheerful, almost too cheerful. "Emily." "You're back early. How was Tacoma?" "Someone's been in my apartment." I said, my voice tight. A pause. "Oh," she said, as if she'd expected this call. "That was Lily. She had a fight with her boyfriend. She needed a place to stay." "You let her stay here." I could hear my voice rising. "Without telling me, you weren't using it," she replied, tone so calm it made me dizzy. I pressed a hand to my forehead. "Mom, this isn't a family guest house. You can't just hand out my keys like it's a spare bedroom." "Don't be dramatic," she said, her sigh sharp enough to cut through the phone. "She's your sister. She's not my roommate." Karen's voice hardened. "You know I don't understand what's happened to you since you moved. You've become so selfish." Lily was heartbroken. "You're acting like a stranger in your own family." My throat felt like it was closing. "Mom, this is my home. You don't get to decide who lives in it," she scoffed. "If it weren't for us, you wouldn't even have that home. We helped with the deposit, remember?" "Don't talk to me about what's yours." I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a whisper. "That doesn't give you the right to take it from me." There was silence. Then her voice softened, full of guilt-coated sweetness. "Sweetheart, we just want you safe and surrounded by family. Why do you push us away?" I hung up before I could cry. I dropped the phone onto the couch and stared at the mess around me. The greasy wrappers, the open laptop, the bed that no longer felt like mine. Every object felt tainted. Even the walls seemed to hold their fingerprints. I sat down at the counter, staring at the salad I'd bought before leaving for the expo. It was still in the fridge, untouched, wilted at the edges. I pulled it out and placed it in front of me, but I couldn't eat. My throat burned, my chest tight. If this was love, it came with fingerprints I never invited. The apartment felt smaller than ever. I picked up one of the soda cans, empty, crushed slightly in the middle, and tossed it into the trash. It landed with a hollow clink that echoed louder than it should have. The silence after that was unbearable. My eyes fell on the spare key hanging by the door, the one my mother had insisted on keeping for emergencies. I grabbed it, turning the cold metal in my hand until it dug into my palm. I wanted to throw it away, but even that felt like an argument I wasn't ready to have. I tried to sleep, but my bed felt foreign. I could still smell Lily's perfume on the pillow, something floral and sweet, a scent that used to remind me of home, but now just made me angry. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's calm face, that practiced innocence she wore whenever she crossed a line. Around midnight, I sat up, heart racing. My chest felt too tight to breathe. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The city outside was quiet rain streaking the windows like scratches. I looked around at what used to be my sanctuary, and realized it wasn't anymore. Something inside me hardened. I grabbed my car keys from the bowl near the door, my fingers trembling. The idea of confronting them terrified me, but the thought of doing nothing terrified me more. I slipped on my coat, stepped into the hallway, and locked the door behind me. The click echoed like the promise. It was time to remind them that this life, this space, belonged to me. The drive from Seattle to Portland felt longer than it ever had before. The road stretched endlessly between dark evergreens, the rain slicing across the windshield like fine glass. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Every mile closer to their house made my chest heavier. I rehearsed the words in my head, but they all sounded too small for what I needed to say. When I finally pulled into the familiar cul-de-sac, the neighborhood looked the same as it always had. Trimmed lawns, wine chimes, cars parked neatly in driveways. The Hartman house sat in the middle, 2 stories of false calm. Through the kitchen window, I could see the warm glow of the oven light. My mother was probably baking something sweet. She always did that when she wanted to control the mood of a conversation. The smell hit me as soon as I walked in cinnamon butter, and something nostalgic that made my stomach twist. She was at the counter pulling an apple pie out of the oven. The curtains were drawn, trapping all that warmth inside. "Emily," she said, surprised but smiling. "You look tired, sweetheart. Sit down. Pie." "No," I said quietly, closing the door behind me. "I just need something from you." Her smile faltered slightly. "What is it? I need the apartment keys back." For a second, the only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock. Her face froze, the pleasant mask slipping away just enough for me to see the irritation beneath. "You came all this way for that?" "Yes," I said. "I want them back." She blinked, setting the pie down a little too hard. "Don't be ridiculous." Dad was sitting at the table reading the newspaper, as though none of this was new. Without looking up, he said, "Parents don't need permission to check on their child." I stared at him. "I'm 32, not 12. He lowered the paper, slowly folding it with deliberate care. "You'll always be our child. And I'm still your mother." Mom added, her voice sharp now. "Don't talk to us like we're strangers. I'm not." I said, my voice trembling despite my best effort to stay calm. "But you can't keep crossing lines like this." She shook her head, incredulous. "Lines? You sound like your therapist. We're family, Emily. Family doesn't need rules." "Yes, they do," I said, "especially ours." Her lips tightened. "You've been living alone too long. That city's made you cold. This isn't about Seattle, Mom. It's about respect." Her eyes narrowed. "You think locking a door is respect?" I took a deep breath, feeling the air press against my ribs. It's boundaries, not punishment. She turned to Dad for backup. "Robert, tell her how insane this sounds." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Honey, you're overreacting. We're just worried about you." "The world's not safe. It's not supposed to be your job to keep it safe for me," I said. "That's mine." Her tone turned defensive, desperate. "You think I like checking up on you? You think I enjoy worrying whether my daughter is eating or working herself sick, or living around God knows what kind of people I swallowed hard? You do it because you can't stop. You call it love, but it's control." She gasped as if I'd slapped her. "Don't you dare accuse me of that. Everything I've done is for you." "I didn't ask for any of it," I said. The kitchen felt smaller by the second. The scent of pie was overwhelming. I stared at the countertop, trying to find my voice again. "Mom, this isn't complicated. I need you to give me the keys." Her hand tightened around the edge of the counter. "And what if I say no?" "Then I'll change the locks." The air between us went still. Her jaw dropped, eyes flashing disbelief. "You wouldn't dare." I met her stare. "Watch me." The sound of the clock ticking filled the pause. Lily's footsteps echoed from upstairs, but she didn't come down. She probably knew better than to interrupt. Mom's eyes shimmered with tears, but I knew they weren't from hurt. They were from rage. She slammed her palm against the counter. The pie dish rattled. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat us. You're ungrateful." "I'm tired," I said softly. "I'm tired of feeling like a visitor in my own life." Dad stood now, his voice firm but weary. Enough, both of you. This is getting out of hand. Finally, she snapped, turning to him. Tell her to stop this nonsense. But he didn't. He just sighed, shoulders heavy, and said, Maybe she has a point, Karen. She spun toward him, furious. You're siding with her, I'm not siding with anyone, he said quietly. I'm just saying, maybe we've gone too far. Her expression broke for a second, like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. Then she turned back to me, voice shaking. You'll regret this, Emily. You'll call one day and no one will answer. Don't expect us to be here when you need us. I nodded slowly. That's your choice. I walked to the door. The pie's sweetness hung in the air, sickly and heavy. I didn't look back when she called my name. I couldn't. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon light cut across the driveway, golden and harsh. I climbed into my car, closed the door, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I could see the house getting smaller as I drove away. The same house where every door had been open, every boundary erased, every secret taken. For the first time, the shrinking image didn't make me sad. It made me breathe. I changed the locks that night, and that was the moment my silence became rebellion. The rain was coming down in sheets when I pulled into the parking lot. My headlights caught the shimmer of puddles, the reflection of the no parking sign swaying in the wind. It had been a long day at the design firm. Client calls, last-minute edits, a presentation that ran over schedule. All I wanted was silence, maybe a glass of wine, and the comfort of my own couch. When I reached my door, something felt off. The faint glow of light slipped through the gap beneath it. I never left lights on. My keys jingled in my shaking hand as I unlocked the deadbolt. The moment the door swung open, my heart dropped. The living room lights were blazing, the air smelled faintly of chamomile tea, and my mother was sitting calmly on my sofa legs, crossed, her coat draped neatly over the armrest. Mom? I whispered, barely able to process what I was seeing. How did you get in? She looked up with a smile that could have been mistaken for warmth if it weren't for the chill running through me. Oh, good, you're home. I was starting to worry you'd be late. I stepped inside slowly, water dripping from my coat, my shoes squeaking against the floor. Mom, I asked how you got in. The landlord, she said casually, sipping her tea. I told him I was worried about you. He's such a nice man, very understanding. I blinked. You talked to Mr. Holstead. How did you even— I called him this morning, she interrupted, setting her cup down. I told him you weren't answering my calls, that you'd been distant lately. I might have implied you were overwhelmed. I stared at her, feeling the blood drain from my face. You lied. She tilted her head. I worried. There's a difference. My voice shook. You had no right. You can't just call my landlord and— Sweetheart, she said, standing up slowly, you live alone in a big city. It's not safe. You can't blame me for wanting to make sure you're okay. Safe, I repeated, almost laughing. You broke into my apartment. She frowned as if I'd said something absurd. Don't use words like that. I didn't break in. He gave me a key. You should be thanking me for having people who care about you. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt. Mom, this isn't caring. This is insane. Her eyes narrowed. Watch your tone, young lady. I almost laughed again, but it came out as a gasp. I'm 32. You don't get to talk to me like that. You can say 32 all you want, she snapped, but you're still my daughter. Then start acting like a mother, not a warden. The silence that followed was sharp, heavy, like the air before thunder. Her expression softened for a moment, but not with regret, only calculation. You've been so alone up here, she said quietly. You work all the time. You don't have anyone. Don't you see? You need family. I took a step back. No, Mom. I need boundaries. Her eyes flashed. If you have nothing to hide, why are you so defensive? My voice broke. Because this is my home and you keep walking into it like it's yours. She shook her head, muttering under her breath. This is what happens when you let those therapists fill your head. Privacy boundaries, independence. They make people selfish. I stared at her, almost trembling. You have no idea what selfish looks like. Her lips tightened. You're being dramatic. I pulled out my phone, my hands steadier than I expected. I'm recording this, I said. She blinked. Excuse me, you heard me. I'm reporting this to the management. I want proof. For the first time, she looked genuinely shocked. You wouldn't do that to your own mother. Watch me. The rain outside grew louder, hitting the windows like applause. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. Wet hair eyes, red, shaking, but calm. She took a step forward, hands trembling. "Emily, please, don't overreact. I didn't mean harm." I backed away, clutching my phone tighter. "Then you shouldn't have lied to get in." She dropped her hands, defeated but angry. "You'll regret this," she muttered, grabbing her coat. "You always make everything harder than it has to be." She brushed past me toward the door, her perfume clinging to the air. When the latch clicked behind her, I stood there for a long time, frozen. Concern shouldn't come with trespassing rights. Later that night, I sat at my desk, drafting an email to the leasing office. I wrote every detail. The false story she'd told, the unauthorized access, my demand for documentation of who had been given temporary keys. I copied the legal aid address Samantha from HR had given me months ago, back when I'd mentioned family issues. I didn't know then I'd actually use it. Before hitting send, I hesitated. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. Somewhere inside me, the voice I'd grown up with whispered, "You're making her the victim." But another voice, smaller, steadier, said, "No, you're protecting yourself." I clicked send. If she could twist love into permission, I'd have to turn fear into action. I crawled into bed, exhaustion heavy in my limbs. The rain hadn't stopped, and the thunder rolled across the city like distant grief. I stared at my phone glowing on the nightstand, the faint light reflecting off the ceiling. One tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. It wasn't from sadness. It was relief and something else. The quiet knowledge that this time I wasn't going to let her win. The elevator doors opened onto the 12th floor with a soft chime, and I stepped out into a space made of glass and rainlight. The office was quiet, all clean lines and pale wood. The kind of calm that costs money. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say the whole way there, but when the receptionist smiled and said, "You must be Emily Hartman," the words disappeared. She led me down a hallway that smelled faintly of lemon and coffee. Inside the corner office, a woman in a navy suit stood to greet me. "I'm Samantha Ortiz," she said, her handshake firm, her eyes steady but kind. "Please sit down." The rain outside tapped softly against the windows, steady and relentless. Samantha opened a folder and clicked her pen. "You said you're having issues with your mother entering your home without permission. Tell me everything from the beginning." I started talking. The words came out jagged at first, like stones tumbling down a hill. About the key, the visits, the landlord, the lies. About the night she sat in my apartment pretending it was love. Samantha didn't interrupt. She just listened, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she nodded once, slowly. "This is what we call enmeshment," she said finally. When family boundaries don't exist because one person sees another as an extension of themselves, it's not normal, Emily. It's not healthy. I stared at the rain behind her. "She's my mother," I said quietly. "I don't want to ruin her life." "You're not ruining hers," Samantha replied. "You're protecting yours." Her tone wasn't harsh, but it landed like truth. I hadn't been brave enough to say out loud. She slid a form across the table toward me. "This is a petition for a restraining order. It doesn't mean she goes to jail. It just means the law acknowledges your right to space." My fingers hovered over the pen. "It feels extreme." "What's extreme," she said gently, "is someone using love as an excuse to violate your safety." The pen felt heavy in my hand. I thought about all the times I'd tried to reason with my mother, all the guilt that followed every attempt to say no. My hand shook as I signed my name. Each letter an act of defiance against years of submission. I wasn't signing a document. I was signing a declaration of ownership. Over my own life. When I looked up, Samantha was already dialing a number. "David," she said into the phone, "come in here a moment." A few seconds later, the door opened and a younger man stepped in. Sharp suit, kind eyes, holding a tablet. "David Kim," he said, shaking my hand. "I'll be helping with documentation," Samantha explained. "We'll need proof. Texts, emails, any photos or security footage that show she entered your home without consent." David nodded. "We'll also want to log any communication from her going forward. Every message, every voicemail. Don't delete anything." I felt exposed, like my life had turned into evidence. Still, I nodded. "I have old messages, some from when she showed up unannounced. I can pull those." Samantha smiled faintly. "Good. This isn't about punishment. It's about proof." The next few hours blurred into work. David helped me sift through my phone marking messages where my mother mentioned visiting without warning. I scrolled through hundreds of texts. Some were harmless, recipes, family updates, but others felt darker now that I read them through new eyes. Stopped by. You weren't home. Left soup on the stove. Your landlord didn't seem friendly. I gave him my number for emergencies. Why do you make me the bad guy? Family checks in. Each one a breadcrumb on the trail of intrusion. Samantha read over my shoulder and said quietly, "She's built her entire identity around controlling you. People like that don't understand boundaries until the law defines them." When we were done, David handed me a flash drive. "This has copies of everything. Keep it safe. You'll need it if she contests." I slipped it into my bag, feeling both protected and hollow. Samantha stood. "We'll file this first thing tomorrow. Once it's processed, she can't legally approach or contact you without consent." I hesitated at the door. What if she hates me for it? Samantha's eyes softened. "She already does, Emily, not because you hurt her, but because you stopped letting her hurt you." Outside, the rain was still falling, but lighter now. I walked to my car slowly, the city glistening in silver reflections. When I looked up, a gap opened in the clouds, a brief flash of sunlight cutting through. It caught the side of a skyscraper, turning the glass gold for a few seconds before fading. It felt like the weather was reminding me, clarity only comes after the storm starts. I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, the signed papers beside me. For years I had waited for her to understand me, to change, to apologize. But maybe the only thing that ever needed to change was what I was willing to accept. When I finally started the engine, the rain had stopped completely. The streetlights reflected on the wet pavement like lines leading somewhere new. The morning light in the office had that cold, filtered look that made everything feel sterile. The hum of printers, the low chatter of designers comparing notes, the click of keyboards. It should have been a normal day at Skyline Design Studio. I stood in front of the presentation screen, pointing to a rendering of a lobby concept I'd been perfecting for weeks. The clients nodded along, polite smiles, pens tapping on notepads. I was finally starting to feel steady again, like the ground under me wasn't shifting anymore. Then I noticed my boss, Meredith, hovering by the conference room door. Her expression wasn't angry, but there was a kind of forced calm that set off alarms in my head. "Emily," she said gently. After the clients left, could we talk for a moment? My stomach dropped. "Sure." We stepped into her office, a space filled with soft gray furniture and framed prints of architectural sketches. She closed the door. "This isn't about work performance," she began. Hands clasped in front of her. "I just wanted to check in with you." "Check in?" I asked, confused. She hesitated. "Your mother called HR this morning. For a second, I didn't move. I couldn't." The words didn't fit together in my mind. What?" "She said she was your emergency contact." Meredith continued carefully. "She told them you've been struggling lately, that you might be under a lot of stress mentally." I blinked, feeling the blood rush to my face. "She told HR. I'm unstable." She framed it as concern. Meredith said quickly, her tone softening. "She said she couldn't reach you and was worried about your well-being. HR felt obligated to notify me." I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My hands were clammy against the side of my skirt. "I'm fine," I said, forcing the words out. "Completely fine." Meredith nodded slowly, her eyes searching mine. I figured as much, but maybe set a clearer boundary with her. This kind of call could really complicate things. "I will," I said, even though the word boundary felt meaningless at that moment. As I left her office, the floor seemed to tilt slightly under my feet. My coworkers smiled as I passed by, none of them knowing I could barely breathe. I sat at my desk staring at my monitor, the design software blurring into unreadable shapes. There it was again, the way she could twist worry into a weapon. That evening, I found myself at a bar 2 blocks from the office, sitting across from Nate. He was my project manager, and the closest thing I had to a friend in Seattle. We'd worked late together so many times the silence between us had become comfortable. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "She actually called your job HR." I said, my laugh bitter. "She said I might be having a breakdown." Nate's eyebrows shot up. "Jesus, Em, that's not just crossing lines. She's erasing them." I swirled my drink, watching the ice melt. "She's my mother. People don't get it. You can't file restraining orders against love." He studied me for a long time. Then Call it survival. The words hung there heavy and simple. Outside, rain streaked down the bar's front windows, turning the city lights into rivers of gold. I kept hearing my mother's voice in my head, soft and manipulative. "You'll thank me someday." "I can't stay here," I said finally. "She knows where I live. She'll never stop." Nate nodded. "Then don't tell her where you're going next." Later that night, I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes. My laptop was open to a list of apartment listings, places with keycard elevators, front desk security cameras in every hallway. I bookmarked one building downtown, newly built all glass and marble and distance. The hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of tape being pulled across cardboard. I packed quietly, methodically, my movements mechanical. I wrapped dishes, folded clothes, boxed up, years of compromise. I didn't cry until I found the small plant my mother had given me when I first moved here. It had withered roots curling dry in the pot. I placed it in the trash, its brittle leaves breaking apart in my hand. This wasn't running away. It was walking toward peace. By midnight, the apartment was mostly bare. My reflection in the window looked like a ghost's, tired, hollow-eyed, but strangely calm. I took one last walk through the rooms, touching the walls as if saying goodbye. I found the spare key still hanging on the hook by the door, the one that had caused all of this. The metal was cool in my hand. I slipped it into an envelope and wrote in small, even letters, "Management. Return." I left it on the kitchen counter. When Nate arrived with his car, the streets were slick and empty. We loaded the boxes in silence. The rain had turned to mist, the kind that sticks to your skin but doesn't fall. In the passenger seat, I watched the city lights pass by, red, yellow, green, reflected in the wet pavement. Every intersection felt like a decision point, every turn a small piece of freedom reclaimed. "Where to?" Nate asked softly. "Just drive," I said. The tires hummed against the road as the skyline faded behind us. Every ending feels wrong until it finally feels quiet. 3 days passed before I turned my phone back on. I'd left it in a drawer since the move, wanting silence, more than connection. When the screen lit up, it glowed like a warning. 67 missed calls, 32 voicemails. My mother, my father, Lily, unknown numbers, even the old neighbor from my previous building. My feed was flooded with notifications, messages, tags, all orbiting the same headline on Facebook. "My daughter, Emily Hartman, is missing. Please, pray." My heart thudded once hard, then steadied. I scrolled through the comments, neighbors offering sympathy, old family friends promising to share the post, strangers writing hope she's found safe. The photo she'd used was years old, college graduation me, smiling politely under a cap I didn't want to wear. I stared at my own face, now repurposed for her drama. I used to think my mother's worst fear was losing me. I was wrong. It was losing control. Outside, rain slid down the tall glass windows of my new apartment, the kind of rain that makes everything quiet. The room was spotless, white walls, wood floors, furniture I'd chosen for its simplicity. No clutter, no ghost. My new life felt like a whisper I didn't want anyone to hear yet. My phone buzzed again. I turned it face down. Meanwhile, in Portland, my family was unraveling. Karen paced the kitchen, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles blanched. "She's not answering. She wouldn't just vanish. Something's wrong." Robert looked up from the couch, trying for calm but failing. "Maybe she just needs space. She's not that kind of girl," she snapped. "We're driving up there." Lily, slouched in a hoodie, groaned. "Mom, she literally moved to get space." "She moved to run away from her problems," Karen said, grabbing her coat. "Get in the car." 2 hours later, their sedan pulled into the familiar parking lot of my old apartment building. The for rent sign had already been replaced by a new tenant's name on the buzzer, Jake and Marissa Collins, but my mother didn't care. "She must be inside," she said, storming toward the door. "She wouldn't just disappear," Robert followed, muttering. "Let's not make a scene." Lily trailed behind, already filming on her phone, saying, "Mom, this is insane." Karen banged on the door with both fists. Emily. "It's Mom. Open up, sweetheart." Inside, a young couple, Jake and Marissa, froze mid-unpacking. Cardboard boxes surrounded them, half-opened, a dog barking nervously from its crate. Marissa whispered, "Who are these people?" Jake peered through the peephole. I have no idea. The pounding grew louder. Emily, Karen shouted. Please, I just need to know you're okay. Jake opened the door an inch, chain still latched. You've got the wrong apartment. Karen's eyes widened with frantic disbelief. Don't lie to me. She lives here. My daughter lives here. No one named Emily lives here, Jake said, trying to close the door. Karen shoved against it and the chain rattled. Robert stepped in, grabbing her arm. Karen, stop! But Lily had already darted toward the stairs, shouting, Maybe she's on the balcony. She tried climbing the railing from the outside walkway, sneakers scraping against wet metal. Lily, Robert yelled. Marissa clutched her phone. I'm calling the police. By now, several neighbors had gathered in the hallway, drawn by the noise. Among them was Grace Miller, who lived directly below. She watched for a second, then quietly hit record on her phone. The lens caught everything. My mother yelling, my sister half on the railing, my father panicking, the neighbors murmuring. Grace's caption would later read, Family drama turns into break-in. Within hours, it would hit 2 million views. Sirens approached before my mother even realized someone had called. The flashing lights painted the wet building in red and blue. The officers jumped out shouting commands. Ma'am, step away from the door. Karen turned, voice high and desperate. She's inside. My daughter's inside. They're lying. Guns weren't drawn for long. Just a second, a flash, but enough to make everyone freeze. Robert held his hands up. Please, it's a misunderstanding. Back away now. One officer said, moving forward. Lily was still clinging halfway up the railing, her hood dripping with rain. She's not answering her phone, Karen screamed. She's hurt, I know it. She wouldn't ignore me. One officer took her gently by the arm. Ma'am, we have no evidence of anyone being harmed here. You need to calm down. I'm her mother, she yelled, struggling as the officer began to guide her toward the patrol car. You don't understand. She needs me. From the sidelines, Grace kept filming. Robert's voice broke as he pleaded with the officers. Please, we're not criminals. But they were technically trespassing disturbance attempted entry. The words echoed like a verdict. Back in Seattle, I sat cross-legged on my bed, my phone buzzing non-stop. The screen flashed with calls from unknown. I knew it wasn't random. It was them. I didn't pick up. The quiet of my apartment pressed around me like a cocoon. I could hear my own breathing steady and sure. For once, I didn't rush to explain, to fix, to apologize for someone else's chaos. For once, I let the silence speak for me. The room smelled like coffee gone cold and paper that had absorbed too many secrets. Fluorescent light hummed overhead, steady and low. I sat at a metal table, hands folded across from a woman in uniform. Her name tag read, Brooks D. She had the calm kind of presence that made you feel both safe and exposed. Ms. Hartman, she said, flipping through a file. Your parents are being held for attempted unlawful entry and disorderly conduct. We just need to verify your safety before we proceed. I nodded, my voice quiet but steady. I'm safe. I just didn't want to be found. Officer Brooks studied me for a moment, then closed the folder. I believe you. You don't seem like someone who disappears without reason. Her tone was professional but not unkind. She stood and opened the door to the adjoining room. They're waiting. Are you sure you want to speak with them? Yes, I said. I need to. The door opened to a small conference space lined with glass. My parents and Lily sat on one side of the table. The sight of them made something twist in my chest. Shame, anger, maybe both. My mother's hair was messy, mascara streaked under her eyes. My father looked deflated as though the air had been let out of him. Lily sat between them, her hands clasped head low. When my mother saw me, she straightened instantly. You did this, she said, her voice trembling with fury. You made us criminals. I took a breath. No, Mom. You made choices. I just stopped cleaning up after them. Robert leaned forward. We were scared for you. That's all. We thought something happened. You were never scared for me, I said, keeping my voice level. You were scared of losing control. There's a difference. Lily began to cry, soft and confused, whispering. We just wanted you home. My mother turned on her. Don't cry, Lily. You didn't do anything wrong. Then back to me. You've lost your mind, Emily. All this, these lies to the police, this humiliation. I raised you better than this. I felt something harden in me the way steel forms under heat. You raised me to feel responsible for your feelings. Not anymore. The door opened behind me and Samantha walked in her heels, clicking against the floor. She was calm, collected a folder under her arm. "Ms. Hartman," she said to me with a nod before turning to the officers. "We've filed the petition. The court has granted a temporary restraining order, pending review." My mother's head snapped up. "You what?" Samantha placed a copy of the order on the table. "The court will enforce this immediately." Karen snatched the paper, scanning it, her hands shaking. "You can't be serious," she said, voice breaking. "She's my daughter. And I'm still your daughter," I said softly. "Just not your property." My father rubbed his forehead, murmuring, "This is going too far." Samantha didn't flinch. "No, Mr. Hartman." "This is as far as it ever needed to go." Officer Brooks stood near the door, reading from the form. "Effective immediately. Karen and Robert Hartman are prohibited from contacting, approaching, or entering the residence or workplace of Ms. Emily Hartman. Violation of this order may result in arrest." The words landed like thunder in the quiet room. My mother's shoulders slumped. Tears filled her eyes, not the manipulative kind, but the ones that come when you realize you've lost the game you thought you were winning. She whispered, "You're punishing us for loving you." "No," I said. "I'm stopping you from hurting me." Lily reached across the table, her small voice breaking through. "Emily, please, can't we just—" I stepped back. "Not right now, Lily." Officer Brooks handed copies of the order to both parents. My mother's tears turned into a soft, desperate sob. "After everything we've done for you, the sacrifices, the years, you'll understand one day when you have children. I hope not." I said quietly, "I don't ever want to love the way you did." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the overhead light and the shuffle of paper as Samantha gathered her things. Officer Brooks gave a short nod toward me. "You're free to go, Ms. Hartman." I turned toward the door, but before I could step out, my mother said, almost pleading, "Emily, please. You don't have to hate us." I stopped but didn't turn around. "I don't hate you. I just can't live under you anymore." Behind me, I heard her collapse into sobs. My father muttered something to comfort her, his voice low, worn down. Lily's chair scraped the floor. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, but I wasn't sure who she meant it for. As I stepped into the hallway, the sound of rain returned, faint through the windows, at the end of the corridor. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Samantha fell into step beside me, her tone steady. "You did the right thing." I nodded, though the ache in my chest said otherwise. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. Sometimes that's the same thing. Outside, the city was gray and quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after everything breaks. I stood under the awning, watching the rain smear the skyline into soft, blurred shapes. It didn't feel like freedom yet, but it felt like the beginning of it. A year later, Seattle looked softer than I remembered. The rain had thinned to mist, the kind that drifted rather than fell, and the city glimmered under a hesitant spring sun from the 12th floor of the Skyline Design Studio. The skyline felt close enough to touch. Cranes still turning, ferries cutting slow across the sound. Life had reshaped itself quietly. I led a new project now, one that had started as a joke during therapy, but turned into something real. Home of Boundaries, I called it, a design series centered around privacy, autonomy, and emotional safety. Floor plans that made space a language again. Rooms built not just for living, but for choosing how to live. Funny how trauma can become design inspiration. While my team debated light angles and material palettes, an email notification appeared at the corner of my screen. The subject line read, "Congratulations, Pacific Design Award, 2024, winner announcement." I clicked it once, then again like I didn't believe it the first time. My throat tightened. After years of shrinking myself to fit other people's definitions of good, I'd built something that was mine, and the world saw it. I stepped away from my desk and looked out the window. The clouds had parted slightly enough for sunlight to hit the top of the Smith Tower, turning its old glass gold. Somewhere below, the Ferris wheel spun lazily over the water. I hadn't realized until that moment that peace wasn't loud. It was subtle like this. Quiet success, undisturbed air, a life no one else edited. Later that afternoon, I walked through Pike Place Market. The air smelled of salt and roasted coffee. Street musicians played near the waterfront, their melodies half lost in the crowd. I turned into a small coffee shop tucked between a florist and a bookstore. Lily was already there, sitting by the window, camera bag slung over the chair beside her. She looked older, less frantic, softer around the eyes. She stood when she saw me, unsure whether to hug or wave, then settled on an awkward half-embrace. "Hey, stranger," she said. Hey, yourself. We sat. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just careful. She stirred her drink, avoiding my eyes for a moment before speaking. Mom's different now, she said finally. She started seeing a counselor after everything. She told me she understands why you needed to lock the door. I nodded slowly. Good. She misses you, Lily said quietly. But she also knows she can't force her way back in. I smiled faintly. That's progress. Lily met my eyes. You think you'll ever talk to her again? Like, really talk? I thought about it. The truth was, I didn't know. But I had stopped measuring love by how close someone stood to me. She can still be in my life, I said finally, just not in my home. Lily smiled a little. I think she'd take that. The barista called out someone's order. The grinder whirred a bell over the door, jingled, as another customer left. Outside, a seagull landed on the railing, bold and unbothered. We talked about smaller things after that. Her photography studio downtown, the part-time gigs she'd picked up shooting local bands. She showed me a few of her photos on her phone. Sunsets, silhouettes, a series of self-portraits that felt braver than anything I'd seen her do before. She was learning how to frame her own world, instead of borrowing mine. When we finished our drinks, Lily reached into her bag. Mom asked me to give you this. She slid a small folded note across the table. My first instinct was to leave it there to protect my hard-earned quiet. But curiosity, or maybe forgiveness, got the better of me. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Slanted, looping, the kind that always looked like it belonged to someone trying too hard to be graceful. It said only one line I'm learning to love, without control. I sat there staring at the words. For the first time, her handwriting didn't make my stomach twist. Lily watched me closely. She really means it, Em. She's trying. I folded the note and slipped it into my coat pocket. That's all I ever wanted. Outside, the late afternoon light hit the cobblestones, turning the wet ground into a mirror. The market crowd had thinned, and the air smelled faintly of spring rain and freedom. Some apologies don't sound like words. They sound like silence, finally respected. We walked together toward the waterfront side by side, but not overlapping, both of us, letting the distance between us be the space where love could finally breathe. The mornings in Seattle had grown quieter somehow. The noise was still there. The ferry horns in the distance, the hum of traffic along the waterfront, but it didn't feel like intrusion anymore. It was rhythm, life. I stood by the kitchen counter, watering the small row of plants along the window. Sunlight broke through the clouds, shimmering against the surface of the Sound, turning the water into sheets of moving glass. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and jasmine. I'd learned to like mornings now, the slow kind, where no one rushed me, no one called, no one knocked. I brewed a cup, the machine hissing softly, and leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise and curl in the air. There was a single black keycard sitting on the table beside me. My key, the only one that existed. I picked it up, turning it between my fingers. Its edges were smooth, the weight familiar. I used to think justice was a loud thing, sirens, verdicts, punishment. Turns out it's quiet. It's the sound of your own lock clicking, and no one else has the key. I glanced around my apartment. The walls were painted a pale gray, the color of early fog. On one shelf sat the Pacific Design Award, the metal plaque gleaming under the light. Next to it, a framed photograph of my team from Skyline Design. All of us laughing after the presentation that had changed everything. No one in that photo knew what it meant for me to stand there that day, to speak, to own something, to not apologize for existing. A gust of wind moved through the open balcony door, carrying in the salt air. I stepped outside, barefoot, coffee in hand. The city stretched below cranes and towers, glinting under a thin layer of sun. I closed my eyes and breathed. For the first time, breathing didn't feel like recovery. It just felt like living. Sometimes at night, I still dreamed of doors. My childhood bedroom, the one that never stayed closed. The apartment in Capitol Hill with its locks that didn't matter. The sound of a deadbolt clicking had once felt like defiance. Now it felt like peace. As I stood there, the memories drifted through like flickers of light. Mom opening my bedroom door without knocking, me crying quietly into my pillow. The flash of police lights outside the old apartment, the papers Samantha handed me, my signature, shaking at the bottom of the restraining order. None of it hurt anymore. It was all part of the same truth. Love without respect isn't love. It's ownership. I went back inside and set my coffee down. My phone buzzed once, a text from Lily, just a photo. This time a dinner table, 2 plates, one of them empty, a candle flickering between them. The message said, "Mom made your lasagna recipe. She's learning. No rush." I smiled, typing only 2 words in response. "Tell her hi." The phone screen dimmed, and I stood there for a moment looking at my reflection in the window. My hair caught the light, my face calm in a way it had never been. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even waiting. They called it love. I called it control. But today I call it the past. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the sink. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint cry of seagulls over the water. I opened the balcony door wider and let the sound in. It filled the apartment like music. For years, I'd thought healing would feel like fireworks, like something bright and loud to mark the end. But it didn't. It felt like this one breath, one quiet morning. One life that belonged to me and no one else. I stepped to the threshold, feeling the cool metal of the door handle against my palm. I looked once more at the keycard in my hand, the small thing that had come to mean everything. Then I slid it into the lock, turned it gently until it clicked. If you've ever been loved in a way that broke your peace, remember, finding peace is also a kind of victory. The door closed behind me with a soft, perfect sound, and the echo lingered long after I'd walked away.